Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Urban Institute's webinar on Family Interventions. What do we know about what works to address youth homelessness? My name is Jasmine Hayes. I am the Deputy Director of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. I'll be facilitating today's call and looking forward to our discussion. Today's webinar is being co-hosted by the Urban Institute and the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation with the Department of Health and Human Services, along with the National Network for Youth and the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Our discussion today will summarize findings and takeaways from a new report on existing family interventions that are designed to prevent youth homelessness or to reunify or emotionally reconnect youth experiencing homelessness with family. Highlighting interventions identified as evidence-based or evidence-informed, along with insights into what makes these strategies successful, our speakers will also highlight lessons learned and challenges for providers with implementing family interventions for this population. We'll hear about the implications from this project for youth homelessness policy and practice at the federal level, as well as general reflections. And then finally, we'll have an opportunity to take questions and dig a little deeper into the findings and implications of what we've learned. A few housekeeping items before we get started. The call is scheduled to last 60 minutes. It's being recorded, and the recording will be sent out along with the presentation after the webinar. All of our panelists will present, and then we'll move to questions. However, you can submit your questions to us throughout the discussion as they come up. Just type your question into the chat box found in your webinar toolbar and hit send. Just a reminder that when you are submitting your questions in the chat box, make sure that you're sending the question to Urban Institute webinar questions, not to the host. If your question is directed to a particular panelist, please note that when you submit your question. We're joined today by both federal and national partners. Our project findings will be shared by Michael Pergament, Senior Fellow with the Urban Institute Center on Labor, Human Services, and Population, and the Principal Investigator of the study, along with Amanda Benton, Social Science Analyst with the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We'll hear from Kimberly Waller, Policy Advisor with the Family and Youth Services Bureau, also at HHS, and Kimberly will highlight policy implications. And then we'll hear from Sharon Mcdonald with the National Alliance to End Homelessness and Amy Louded with the National Network for Youth, who will offer reflections from the national perspective. For more information on our speakers and their background, please visit the Urban Institute's website, which has the speaker biographies. All right, so before we move to the project findings, I think it's helpful to provide some context for how we got here. When we think about family relationships, and by family we mean however defined by a young person, those relationships are a protective factor against youth homelessness, while at the same time we know that family conflict is a primary driver of youth homelessness. The National Runaway Safe Line notes that more than any other issue, approximately 35% of calls are from youth who are calling to talk about family dynamics. Common family conflicts may be related to alcohol or drug use, sexual activity, pregnancy, school problems, step-parent relationships, and sexual orientation and gender identity. And this can also impact religious differences. The research also tells us that most young people who experience homelessness do return home, and that reunification is associated with better outcomes for youth. This highlights the important role that family interventions can have on either preventing homelessness from occurring or with reducing the length of time that a young person is experiencing homelessness. So another way to think about this is that family relationships and family conflict are flip sides of a coin that can be risk or protective factors for youth experiencing homelessness, and that most youth, especially younger youth, ultimately end up returning home. Kimberly will talk about what we know from RHY program data in just a moment, but I do want to highlight findings from a 2007 study by Milburn and colleagues that found over 70% of newly homeless youth in Los Angeles between the ages of 12 and 20 return home for at least a significant time within 2 years. We know that reunification may be more common among younger adolescents, but there are older youth who will also return home. We know from multiple studies that reunification may be less likely if those relationships have been strained by years of conflict, but that it's critically important to help young people establish or maintain some form of relationship with family that has healthy boundaries. In fact, another study, and this was with Thompson and colleagues, found that youth who returned home after a shelter stay tend to report more positive outcomes in school, employment, self-esteem, reduced criminal behavior, and family relationships than those who were discharged to non-familial settings. Building on what we know and what the research tells us, the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation within HHS commissioned the study from the Urban Institute to better understand existing practices and interventions that have some level of evidence behind them. So the goal here, whenever possible, is to prevent youth from leaving home, and if not, to reunify youth as quickly and stably as possible with family when safe and appropriate, at least to help them reconnect emotionally, even if a physical reunification isn't feasible. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Mike and Amanda to walk us through the project findings.
Thank you, Jasmine. So as Jasmine mentioned, the overall goal of the study is to really look through what interventions were out there that were involved youth and their families, to understand what level of evidence there really is for what do we know about these interventions in terms of their effectiveness, and to get a feel for some of the issues with implementing interventions. There were two main components then to the project. One was a very systematic literature review, and we searched basically everything there is, not just online, but so-called gray literature, which is reports that maybe don't show up in peer-reviewed journals. We also sent out a request for submissions for any providers or others who knew of programs that maybe didn't get picked up in this kind of literature search, and in the end looked over the 1,300 studies, found 87 that had something to do with family engagement, and those represented 49 interventions. Then we classified them into one of 5 evidence levels, and I'll talk in a minute about the criteria for getting these different classifications, but we call it evidence-based, evidence-informed, promising, emerging, and then what we call of interest. And then we classified them by the main focus of what they're trying to accomplish, whether it was prevention, reunification, or reconnecting youth with their families when perhaps they wouldn't actually reunify and live together. The criteria for classifying the interventions, then these are the 5. Go through this very briefly. It's actually a long set of criteria, and if you look at the report, you can see it's much, much more detailed. These are just examples, and these are sort of the most common ways that the intervention got classified. So to be evidence-based, you have to have multiple randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, and at least one of those had to be done with youth experiencing homelessness. So it's very important that we know a lot of interventions that show effectiveness in one location or with one population, and then don't show effectiveness when they're repeated elsewhere. So they try to meet these 2 criteria. To be evidence-informed then means you've done multiple high-quality RCTs, but none of them were with youth experiencing homelessness. So our literature review picked up a lot of interventions that are used in other sectors, primarily child welfare and juvenile justice. And so that's a lot of those would be eligible in this category. The other way, though, is if there was just a single RCT, but it was done with youth experiencing homelessness, then that would be evidence-informed, but not raise the level of evidence-based where you need the multiple RCTs. Promising have done a single RCT. The study quality may have lacked something important, but it was decent and included youth experiencing homelessness. So those are things where an improved program or an improved study might raise it up to a higher level of evidence, but right now we would call it promising. Similarly, if it was with youth not experiencing homelessness, but it was an RCT that had the kind of components we think are relevant for serving this population, it could be promising. Emerging means this is the most typical is a pre-post, so there's no randomization, there's no actual comparison group. So it looks like good outcomes, and we have nothing to compare it to, so we call those emerging. And lastly, the of interest means it's got the kind of components that we expect to see or think would be beneficial for this population. but really either hasn't shown, a lot of these just haven't even looked at their outcomes, to be honest. The other part of the study was conversations we held with key informants. We talked to 10 different organizations that represented advocates, practitioners, researchers, and technical assistance providers to try to get more information about their program and how they implement it and what their challenges are and what they've learned. We also tried to talk to them about some of the gaps we found in the literature, which I'll talk about in a minute, but see if, what they know more, if they could fill in any of those gaps, and what their views were on the additional needs for research. This is only a small number of people that we spoke with, so obviously their perspectives may not be a complete picture of the field. So here's the basic results, and I'll focus first on the columns, the level of evidence, and what you see is we found 2 interventions that we were able to label as evidence-based, and 4 that we were able to label as evidence-informed. So only 6 out of the 49 that have raised themselves up to a reasonably high level of evidence. 10 that are promising, 16 emergency, and 17 of interest. You can see that most of this is kind of loaded toward the bottom end, and that is essentially the state of the field in runaway and homeless youth services, which is where a lot of things people are out there trying to do, but not a lot that have gone through any kind of formal evaluation to figure out what really works. On the rows, in terms of the classification, you'll see they really bulk up prevention. That's a little bit deceptive because we use this order as a hierarchy. We only assign them 1 condition, so that some of the interventions do try to attack, say, both prevention and reunification. They would be listed as prevention, but there really are a lot in the prevention, primarily because so many of these come out of other service sectors than runaway and homeless youth. So when we look at the 6 interventions that have some level of evidence, and what you see is that these all are sort of different sorts of therapeutic approaches. I'm not going to go into the details of what each of these are. You can look in the report. There's a description of what the intervention is and its components and references, but the 2 evidence-based or ecologically based family therapy and functional family therapy, and remember that means they've both been evaluated and found positive outcomes for youth experiencing homelessness. The 4 evidence-informed interventions: multidimensional family therapy, multi-systemic therapy, treatment foster care Oregon, which many people know as multidimensional treatment foster care, and then STRIVE, skip the acronym, that is, if you remember back to how I said how you got to be evidence-informed, that is the one of these 4 that has only a single RCT, but it was done with youth experiencing homelessness. So that's an intervention that has demonstrated some effectiveness, but probably would benefit from a replication. So what do these 6 interventions have in common? We tried to look at what are kind of the core components, which is what you need to think about if you're going to use these somewhere else, scale this up and replicate them. And we identified 4 basic components. One is they all offer home-based services. So they may offer services in other locations, clinics, shelters, et cetera, but they all offer something in the home. And in fact, in the STRIVE evaluation, although they let the family choose to get their services, every family chose to have it in the home. They all have some combination of clinical services and parent training. They all have multiple intensive sessions. So these are long-term interventions. They're not light touch. They tend to be a lot of sessions. The sessions generally, they can last different lengths of time for the intervention, but an hour would be very typical, although some of them have multiple short check-in sessions, but these are intensive interventions. And because of their therapeutic, they all tend to be overseen by graduate-level therapists with either masters or PhDs. So what are the gaps? Well, the first gap one I think was clear. Yes, we found 6 interventions that have some level of evidence. That's the good news. But the fact is we find that's there are very few evaluations of family interventions that have been rigorous to establish a real level of evidence. Another thing we found as we were trying to understand the outcomes of these interventions is that few of them actually track housing or homelessness outcomes. So most of these, to be fair, are targeted at some behavior or condition that is related to the likelihood of homelessness, for example, substance abuse. So they don't tend to track the eventual outcome of whether this helps with reduced homelessness. I mentioned that a lot of the interventions come out of child welfare and juvenile justice, and so we think that a lot of benefit can come. We didn't find a lot where the runaway homeless youth system intersected with those systems to really take an intervention and try to adapt it, say, so there could be a lot more collaboration and cross-sector learning. And it has been pointed out by many of the people we've spoken with that the youth being served by each of these service sectors are frequently all the same youth. A very big gap in the evidence is for both LGBTQ youth and racial ethnic minorities, both of whom are way overrepresented within the runaway homeless youth population. People have learned to be sensitive to the needs of these populations, but there are very few interventions that specifically address their needs. They're designed for them, and even among the few, there are even fewer that have ever gone through any kind of rigorous evaluation. Schools, we think, provide an opportunity, and we found only about 1 out of 7 interventions even makes a connection to school, and then it's usually something about the youth school plans, but we really didn't find where schools are more fundamentally involved due to their interaction with the families in dealing with the youth homelessness situation, if it's an unaccompanied youth as opposed to youth family homelessness. There may be other things schools are doing, but in terms of this type of intervention, family engagement, we really didn't find that. And then last, we found that although a lot of runaway homeless youth programs use various sorts of screening tools and assessment tools, it's used for identifying service needs, they really don't have a good tool for saying, is family engagement, is a family intervention the appropriate intervention for this youth, and if so, which type of intervention do we need? And so it's another sort of gap in the literature. And I will now turn over to Amanda.
Thanks, Mike. So in addition to the findings about the actual interventions, we used some of the other findings from the literature review and some of the key informant conversations to really dig into the implementation side of things. So what do we know about the practical aspects of implementing some of these interventions? First, we found that it's really important to think carefully about engaging parents. Parents in stressed families may be overwhelmed. They might perceive involvement from public systems or providers as intrusive or judgmental. They might not even trust some of the services being offered. There is some research that suggests that parental engagement can help facilitate youth participation. So we heard from key informants that it's really important to identify any potential barriers to parental involvement, say high parent stress, to identify those early on and address them. One key informant said to, quote, work with and not against parents. We also heard from the key informants that because of this the role of parental involvement, it's helpful to connect parents with resources, maybe even considering educating them on adolescent brain development science. We also found that some staff may have trouble hearing about the harm caused to youth by families on one hand, and then pivoting to try and build on the family's strengths on the other hand. So there's some innovative approaches to try and address that by potentially considering separate staff for dealing with those two functions, or offering trained staff on respecting youth wishes about the relationship that they want to have with their families. We also found that it's really important to hire staff who are skilled at engaging parents through role play, mentoring, coaching, things like that. That's a particularly important function. Another key implementation lesson is the importance of making team decisions. So the research suggests that case management plans can be more effective when multiple perspectives are represented. So when youth and families set and commit to their own goals, they're bought into the plan, they're much more likely to participate and really engage in the effort. This is particularly appropriate and feasible when we're thinking about programs for serving runaway and homeless youth, because it doesn't necessarily require long-term service participation, which in some runaway and homeless youth settings is difficult just by the nature of the program design. And to harken back to what Jasmine pointed out earlier, we are talking here about family involvement, and with family defined broadly by the youth, not to just include, for example, biological parents. Another key lesson on implementation is that it's really important to offer services in multiple locations and have multiple sessions. So Mike was saying earlier that one of the core components of the interventions that were evidence-based or evidence-informed is to offer services in multiple locations, including the family home. But that's also a practical lesson for other intervention models that programs might consider. You know, parents have a lot of responsibilities. They may be involved in multiple services, so delivering services in the home can help ease their involvement and can be really critical. Parents and families may be running around, be really busy and can't necessarily run around the community to go to where the provider is. If the provider can come to them and the parents can choose the setting, such as their home, then they can access the services in a comfortable and convenient space. Milburn and colleagues actually found that youth experiencing homelessness might actually prefer that family sessions occur in the family home. So that can be kind of a win-win for both the youth and the family. Mike also mentioned that a core component of the interventions that were evidence-based or evidence-informed is that they're generally intended to be delivered over several months, but there are some creative options for doing that. Some of the interventions we looked at included frequent coaching and check-ins via telephone, for example, to try and make those maybe more practical to implement in certain situations. Another implementation lesson is the importance of offering ongoing support. It's really critical to do frequent coaching and check-ins in the weeks and months after reunification to help families and youth sustain the conflict resolution or other skills that they've learned, though the duration and frequency of those check-ins might vary. One key informant pointed out that this is long-term work that needs to be sustained. Some families, in some cases, have been dysfunctional for a long time, and it can take time to rebuild that trust between the young person and his or her family. So that is important to kind of make sure to provide that ongoing safety net and support. In addition to the lessons, of course, we also found some challenges in implementing family interventions. For those of you on the call who are providers, I'm sure many of these will resonate with you. One of the things we heard is that some of these are difficult, actually, to implement in runaway and homeless youth settings. The core task of many of these programs, particularly the basic center programs, is to house youth quickly. But we're talking about the importance of kind of the ongoing supports. And so some providers are well equipped to start the important work of family interventions, but continuing it may be beyond the scope in some cases if they're not part of a larger multi-service agency, or they might need to collaborate with partners in the community, for example, substance use providers, child welfare agencies, and others. We also heard repeatedly that one of the challenges in this space is that it's really hard to choose which family intervention to use. There are a lot of options, and as Mike was saying, there's only a few that have a stronger evidence base. So programs really have to kind of assess their own needs and capacity, the population they're serving, and choose the right model. So we do hope that this project helps with that task by compiling everything in one list. And the report appendix includes descriptions of all of the interventions and some references, but we do know that it still can be a little overwhelming. And one thing to point out is that RYTAC, the Runaway and Homeless Youth Training and Technical Assistance Center, can offer assistance to runaway and homeless youth grantees in figuring out which intervention model might make sense for a specific organization. Another challenge is that implementing evidence-based and evidence-informed interventions is not without its costs. You know, you have to hire and train qualified staff, monitor program fidelity, budget sufficient staff time to do all this follow-up that we're talking about. We heard from Mike that a core component of the evidence-based and evidence-informed interventions is that they're often delivered by graduate-level therapists. There can be high staff turnover in some runaway and homeless youth programs, so retraining can be a consideration. So certainly these are not without cost. However, in some cases it may turn out that some of these interventions are actually cost-effective for some youth if we're preventing long-term homelessness or system involvement among youth. The other reminder we heard from key informants is to really keep in mind the big picture, that families and youth often have complex needs, and it might not be just about the relationship between the two. Youth might have severe mental health challenges. Families may be focused on meeting their own basic needs, material needs, and their affordable housing challenges. And so connections with housing or childcare for younger children in the family or other social service providers can be really key. So what did we at the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at HHS take away from this? First, in terms of research, this review identified dozens of interventions that might be ready for further evaluation. Some might be ready for a really rigorous study, and others, like those that were categorized as of interest or emerging, could benefit from process evaluations or formative studies. We all know that reunification is a key strategy for ending youth homelessness, but the review identified 6 reunification interventions, 3 categorized as of interest and 3 as emerging. So there's really a lot more work that has to be done in this space, and for providers to share with each other and federal partners and researchers about what seems to be working, for federal partners to help highlight those efforts and researchers to help evaluate them more rigorously. Based on the core components and some of the implementation lessons, there are, we think, some key takeaways for providers that working with the family to make services available in the family home can be really helpful. The importance of getting buy-in from youth and family by getting them involved in developing their own case management plan, offering supports that include multiple sessions and follow-up as much as possible, and whenever appropriate and feasible, using trained professionals to provide clinical services. The last kind of big takeaway for us is really on this point that Mike briefly hit on around the importance of cross-sector learning. A lot of the interventions identified in this report came from the child welfare system, and some came from juvenile justice. These are often serving similar high-risk populations, and unfortunately some of these same youth are cycling in and out of these systems. So supporting family relationships as far upstream as possible could prevent involvement in any of these systems. Similarly, schools are often the very first point of identification for youth who have run away or been kicked out or who are on the verge of doing so, but schools aren't always naturally equipped to support this kind of family intervention work, so all sectors really can and should be learning from each other about what works and what doesn't. So overall, we think this is an important piece of research and hope it revealed some key information for the field, but we know there is still much more work to be done at all levels.
Great, thank you so much. So this is Kimberly Waller. I'm a policy advisor at the Family and Youth Services Bureau. Just really quickly, one of the programs within FISB is the Runaway and Homeless Youth program. I know many people on the call are very familiar with this program, but very quick recap. RISE funds 3 major programs: the Basic Center program, which is emergency shelter for youth up to age 18, and just a quick focus, one of the major focuses of this program is family reunification services and supports, and the Transitional Living Program, which includes the maternity group home. And those are programs that serve youth between the ages of 16 and 22. Data shows that a lot of times that number trends low, so a lot of 16 and 17-year-olds. So a lot of those programs also focus on family reunification, and then the street outreach program. So just a little bit of information about some recent RIDE data collection efforts. We have a relatively new data collection study, the street outreach program. The purpose of it was to better understand service needs of street youth. And what we learned from this study, and a lot of this stuff is not going to be new information to people that have been working in this field but 74% of youth reported being kicked out or they left due to family conflict. Average length of time homeless is 23 months, and the average age at first experience with homelessness was 15 years. You know, again, I don't think this is totally new information for people, but we did learn a lot of additional information in that study, and so I included the the link there if you're interested in learning more. And then this is some information between the years of 2000 and 2014. This is collected through our kind of traditional data system, which is called RIMUS. So what we know is, so I kind of pulled the Basic Center program stats. So over those 14 years, this program served over 620,000 youth under the age of 18. And of those youth, 66% of those youth, and that varies per year. I think the most recent was around 69%, 70% exited the Basic Center program to their parent or legal guardian's home. And many more of these youth received reunification services before even having to enter the shelter through the Basic Center program. And so why is this data important? I think it's important because it, again, tells us what we already know. Youth homelessness is largely driven by family conflict, and many of these youth reunify. And so two things here. The first is, you know, the field has been responding to this for decades, and you and the field are evidence-based. So we're learning from what these programs are doing. And then on the flip side of that is this report and the research that we're doing is incredibly helpful for us to share what works and for us to share what programs are doing and, you know, to learn from each other. I think that peer-to-peer and provider-to-provider learning and also provider to local, state, and federal policymakers is incredibly important. And so, you know, I think that it's on us now that we have this information, and I like what Amanda said. I mean, I think it is really intimidating and difficult to figure out which intervention to use. And so having all of these together in one area, I think it'd be really helpful for, like I said, peer-to-peer learning, but also for your federal partners, for us to get this information out to the field. The second piece is this is just the beginning. We have to continue to learn about what works, and I just wanted to call out an example of an area that we're doing this as well. There's the Transitional Living Program Evaluation Project, where we are really going to figure out what impacts and outcomes are happening with the youth in TLP. I think that we, like Mike had said, you know, there's a lot of information that we don't know, and so we just need to continue the process of learning, continue the process of sharing what we are doing with each other, learning from each other, and we are here as a resource for you, and we also love learning from you because the field is where the evidence base is. So that is what I have. My other slides that I just wanted to include are some resources. This is the FISB website, RITAC, which is our TA provider, and they also include additional materials on evidence-based practices as they relate to the runaway and homeless youth field, and FISB, the National Runaway Safe Line, and the National Clearinghouse on Families and Youth, which also has some really great resources. And then I included my contact information. Like I said, I'm here as a resource, and Chris Holloway, who is the program manager for the Runaway and Homeless Youth program.
Great, thanks, Kimberly. Before we move to Sharon and Amy, I just want to remind folks that questions can be submitted through the chat box function, and a reminder to submit them to Urban Institute webinar questions. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Sharon Mcdonald, Director for Families and Youth with the National Alliance to End Homelessness.
Thank you. I want to start by just thanking everybody involved, Urban Institute and HHS, for this important focus, this webinar, and this wonderful report. A couple of years ago, the Alliance and our federal partners, pulled some practitioners together to explore family interventions and what practitioners were learning about how to help homeless youth return home. And one of the things that one of the participants said that really just stuck with me was that as a field, he felt, we were really underutilizing families as resources and big resources in helping youth return home, and that if we improved our ability to strengthen families and the relationship between youth and their parents, that many instances of homelessness among youth could be avoided in the first place, shortened, and the safety and well-being of youth and their families would be enhanced when youth return home, as most youth do, as you said. So one of the things I kind of wanted to use my couple minutes here in is thinking about what we should be doing in the shelter world and the homeless services world. And what I think one of the biggest lessons for me is the importance of integrating offers of family support across the homeless service system for youth. We are seeing programs that are integrating offers of family support when parents or their children are calling homeless youth shelters to see if homelessness can be diverted with some support. That there can be and should be outreach within shelter and transitional housing programs for youth with offers of request to provide family mediation, for counseling, intervention. I want to reiterate the idea of outreach to families. What people have told us is that, parents can be pretty angry, particularly in the early days after youth has left home, and so some outreach may be needed, and we need to be able to offer services at a level that they're willing to accept. There's also some youth who may be more prone to running away, which can include LGBT youth and young people with child welfare histories, so advertising services in schools, other kinds of ways to reach some of these vulnerable populations might be something that we look at. Another observation that, I think is important for homeless service providers to think about is having resources and tools in our toolbox to help families with poverty. Sometimes the young person seeking shelter is separated from their family because the family doesn't have resources to help them stay home, or they're doubled up and there's not enough space and the young person's ejected. And so if we actually move our focus from the individual to the youth, to the family as a unit, we might be able to keep more youth together with their parents. And then the other observation I just wanted to stress that we've learned is that improving the relationship with family or family members is valuable to youth on their future prospects, even if a return home is not a possibility. So if it looks like, we should still make an offer of family support because they'll be better off, both youth and families. So I also want to make a plug that the Alliance is very interested in learning more about program models and strategies that people on the call may be implementing and find to be effective. We're also very interested in learning about how you're funding those programs. We think that family intervention is a critical area where we need to do some growth and learn from the field. I just want to make a plug for some, Eva's Place in Toronto has a toolkit that might be a resource. Ruth Ellis in Detroit is adapting the Family Acceptance Project to build support for LGBT youth who are at risk of homelessness or already homeless. And Cocoon House in Washington has been doing some prevention work. So there's all this great innovation in the field. We feel like we've only touched the very surface of it. And so if you're doing some work that we could benefit from, please do reach out to us. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sharon. And now I'm going to hand things over to Amy Loudit, Public Policy Associate with the National Network for Youth.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much. I definitely want to reiterate Sharon's appreciation for everybody involved in this project and moving it forward. We are at a really crucial time here looking at things from a federal perspective, from a national perspective, in that our landscape of family and youth homelessness is starting to shift, and we're starting to collaborate with more partners and more systems that haven't traditionally worked with families and youth in the past, specifically unaccompanied homeless youth and youth who have run away from family conflict and situations like that. And so I don't want to take a whole lot of time because a lot of the folks that spoke before me did a really great job of recapping kind of what we see from the national perspective, but I do just want to elevate a few things, and that's that these collaborative relationships, as I said, moving into this shift in the landscape of dealing with youth homelessness is really instrumental in providing those ongoing supports to families, and both as a preventative model, an intervention model, as well as aftercare services for when youth are exiting programs and trying to reconnect or even potentially reunify with their families. Some of the reasons that those are so crucial, on the parental engagement piece, youth frequently leave due to family conflict after feeling rejected or thrown away, for example, by their families. And so I would like to elevate the role that school liaisons in homeless education projects are really the link that many families, the first link that many families engage with in order to be connected to their community resources, their family resources. And so many times these liaisons are, they're in communities where runaway and homeless youth programs that have been focused on this work, as Kimberly pointed out, for over 40 years now. The liaisons are in communities where those runaway and homeless youth programs don't necessarily exist, but they're aware of the community programs that they do have that may be able to help. And because of that relationship building between the liaisons and the families, they're often the trusted kind of agency representative, if you will, by the families, and so they can be heavily influential and involved in some of those family reunification efforts, and at least linking them to the resources, linking families to the resources that are needed. Additionally, I really like the point that making case management youth-centric is really, really important for many youth who do feel that they have been thrown away or rejected by their family. Being able to establish their own, and this is all information that we hear at the National Network for Youth from our members who are community-based organizations and runaway and homeless youth providers largely, that youth-centric model of case management building really gets the buy-in from the youth. And being able to see that their parent is also engaged eases frequently many of those tensions that existed before family reunification or family reconnection starts. And so just to wrap up, I'll just point out that I think it's apparent from all of this work that what we can see is that in the youth work and housing models and space, these services have to be really intensive on both the youth perspective and the family's perspective in order to reunify youth with their families or to reconnect, if that's what's truly, to emotionally reconnect, if that's what's truly appropriate for that family. And so with that, I will turn it back over to the Urban Institute.
Great, thanks, Amy. All right, folks, we have a bit of time for questions, so please go ahead and continue to submit them. We're going to start with the first question. I'm going to direct that to Mike. What age group are family interventions effective with? How is youth being defined here?
Well, okay, the easy part is how we define youth, which is ages 12 to 24 and the studies had to have had that age group as a focus, not just included as part of a larger group. What age group family interventions are effective with, I'm not sure we really know the answer to that. I think from the things we know, it could go actually in either direction. What that is, younger, say adolescents who haven't created a long history of family conflict probably have in some ways the best opportunity for a family intervention to, especially in a prevention sense, but even in reunification to be effective. But we also know that, let's say, time away from family conflict might lead to improved possibilities and maybe more on the reconnection end. So that, I don't think we certainly didn't study it from this way, and I don't know that anyone really knows, but that's a good question to think about, which is, as I said, I'm just guessing here that the bottom end of the age range is probably a better reunification type of intervention, and the upper end more of a reconnection intervention.
Thanks, Mike. And I think the connected to Sharon's earlier point where she noted that it just really is important to think about integrating offers of family support across the continuum of services, right? So to your point of some of the interventions may be appropriate for perhaps the under 18, but we also don't want to lose sight of the importance for our older youth, even if they are not physically going back home, that there is still a need there for some kind of long-term connection to their family or to their natural supports, however they define that for themselves. Okay, we have another question. What sorts of short-term housing interventions work best in conjunction with family interventions? Any insight on the difference between shelters, transitional housing, host homes, et cetera? I'm going to direct that to Amanda.
Thanks, Jasmine. So this is a really great question, and I think this is another area where we have a lot more learning to do. One of the things Mike pointed out that really struck a chord with me as I was going through the study and really understanding the findings is that very few of these interventions actually track housing and homelessness status as an outcome, and I think that's a real wake-up call to child welfare and juvenile justice sectors, but also to runaway and homeless youth programs, researchers, providers, everyone, that we really need to do a much better job of tracking housing and homelessness status so that we can start to answer some of these questions about, for example, the difference between different housing models. The other thing I would just flag as kind of an upcoming opportunity where we may learn some more, the Department of Housing and Urban Development just closed a funding opportunity related to $33 million for a youth homelessness demonstration that's really designed to set up a community-wide systems approach to addressing homelessness among young people. And I think the idea behind the demonstration and what we expect for communities to do is to really test innovative strategies at the local level and understand, what are the right ways to put together these different pieces of shelter and transitional and host homes and rapid rehousing and family intervention, and understanding how those pieces fit together and which strategies, what are the right ways to implement those for which youth and in which scenarios. So I think that's a really great opportunity for learning that will start coming out in the coming months and years. And then Kimberly, I also want to turn to you to talk about.
Yeah, so as I had kind of briefly mentioned about the Transitional Living Program evaluation that's going to be coming out, so I think two things on that. One, the TLP program funds, it's kind of a variety of models, which include transitional housing, your kind of traditional group home style, but also scattered site. And also TLPs can fund host homes. So we learn a lot about what the programs are doing within the TLP program. But also, this is an opportunity, as we've kind of said, like the RIE program has been around for 40 years. I think the first TLP programs were funded in the 90s. And this is a good opportunity, this evaluation project is a really good opportunity to kind of figure out from that wealth of knowledge what's going on, what's working, and again, just kind of learning from each other about what these programs are doing well.
Great, thanks, Kimberly. All right, our next question, I'm going to direct this to Amanda. While emphasizing multiple perspectives, you mentioned both parents choosing location and youth choosing home. Seems contradictory. Could you please clarify or expand?
That is an excellent question. Apologies for being unclear. I think, I think what we took away from the research and from the key informant conversations is that, and particularly thinking about these evidence-based and evidence-informed interventions, is that one of the things they have in common is that they offer services in multiple locations. So, in an ideal world, services would be available in multiple locations, in the family home, also maybe in a shelter or a transitional program, in a clinical setting, in a school setting, and different interventions, of course, will make sense to be offered in some or all of those settings. It's also not necessarily practical to offer an intervention and services in every single one of those settings and every time, but to the extent possible, it seems like it's really helpful to offer services in multiple locations. And one of those seems to be of particular interest to both parents and youth, based on what we found, is that often the family home is a setting that both parents and youth, or family and youth, will choose as a place that they might want to receive services in. Hopefully that clarifies.
Great, thanks. All right, our next question, I'm going to start with Kimberly, and then I'm also going to ask Sharon and Amy to weigh in. What can be done on the federal level to tackle the homeless youth issue, especially among homeless students?
So that's a great question, and I'm going to focus on the latter part of that, connecting homeless students into this issue. So on the federal level, we have a lot of interagency partnerships and work groups that we engage in, and Department of Education is consistently at the table as we have these conversations. And so one of the things that we do and that is crucially important in both the Runaway and Homeless Youth Program field and with other youth providers is connecting these programs to their McKinney-Vento liaisons and making sure that that connection is strong. And so the Department of Ed and HHS and our other federal partners are committed to continuing that work, and a lot of that stuff happens on the local level. And then the other thing that I wanted to lift up with this question as well is Amanda had mentioned the HUD, the youth demo that HUD is starting to engage in, and in that demo is kind of this push for system-level work and integration with other systems. And so encouraging COCs and other and youth providers to really link up with your child welfare agencies, your schools. And so I think that that work is going to continue, and on the federal level we'll continue to push that.
Thanks, Kimberly. I'm going to ask either Sharon and or Amy, did you want to weigh in on that question?
Sure, this is Sharon. I think one of the most important things we need to recognize about homelessness among youth is how insufficient our response is. It's, people are doing masterful jobs but the demand is, far higher than the supply of resources for youth. And so the last HUD's point-in-time count of census of homeless youth, and by homeless in this definition, I mean youth who are, the point-in-time captures youth who are on the street or in shelter programs, found almost half of the youth that were identified were outdoors, in outdoor settings, and that included minor youth. And so we really need to figure out how we're going to scale up an emergency crisis response so that no youth is unsheltered, no youth should be unsheltered. And we also have to recognize that, the homeless youth, youth do better, we've heard it today, when they stay connected to families or when they return home to families or retain that relationship. They also do better, it appears, when they stay connected to school. And yet very often to help youth get to a program that is youth-focused, they have to relocate because most communities don't actually have a youth program in their community. So we need to look at some innovative models, things like host homes, which can be scaled up in the community of origin where the youth is. We need to look at ways to kind of reduce the strain on the shelter system so that the youth, frees up some space to help other youth in crisis. So we have, I think, a lot of work to do in order to improve the lives of young people. And I'm hoping that we're going to do that.
Great, thanks, Sharon. All right, so we actually are at the end of our webinar today. The last question was actually on where the complete list of the 49 interventions is posted and how you can learn more about those interventions. The last slide that you have in front of you actually has a link to where the report is posted. So I want to again thank all of our panelists for joining us today. I think this was a great discussion. I know there were a lot of other questions. We think this is going to be an ongoing discussion. We look forward to continuing to learn from those of you out in the field. Any additional questions, I think those can be directed to through the chat box, and we will also, we have the email addresses for Amanda Benton and Mike Pergament with their, both at the Urban Institute and at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, so please submit any additional questions that didn't get answered today. And again, just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded. It will be posted online, and the presentations will also be shared. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.